In the summer of 1947, a British lawyer sat alone in a villa in New Delhi. He had never been to India before arriving 6 weeks earlier. He spoke none of the local languages. He had no expertise in South Asian history, culture, or geography, and he had been given 5 weeks to draw a line through one of the most densely populated regions on Earth, a line that would divide a subcontinent, create 2 nations, separate communities that had lived alongside each other for centuries, and determine the fate of 88 million people. His name was Cyril Radcliffe. He finished the job, collected his fee, left India before the violence started, and never spoke publicly about what he had done for the rest of his life. What followed his line was one of the largest and bloodiest human catastrophes of the 20th century. Up to 2 million people died, 14 million were displaced. All this happened in just 6 weeks. This is the story of the partition of India, the birth of Pakistan, and the line that a lawyer drew in 5 weeks, that the subcontinent is still bleeding from today. Subscribe to History Under Radar right now. We bring you history that you might never have heard of before. In order to fully understand what partition meant, you definitely have to understand what India was before it. The Indian subcontinent was not a collection of separate Hindu and Muslim nations waiting to be divided. It was one of the most extraordinary examples of religious and cultural coexistence in human history. For centuries, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others had built cities together, worshipped in sight of each other's temples and mosques, shared markets, shared festivals, shared food. Intermarried in some regions, built a civilization together that was ancient and complex and irreducible to simple religious categories. Yes, there was tension. Yes, there was communal violence at times, but the idea that India was a land of 2 irreconcilable peoples who could not live together was not an ancient truth. It was a relatively modern political construction, and the British helped build it. The British policy of divide and rule had deliberately cultivated religious difference as a tool of colonial management for decades. Separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims introduced in 1909. Political representation tied to religious identity rather than geography or class. A deliberate strategy of making Indians think of themselves as members of competing religious communities first, and Indians second. By the time Britain decided to leave India in 1947, the communal identity they had spent decades cultivating had taken on a life of its own. The decision to partition India was made in extraordinary haste. Britain was exhausted from World War II, economically devastated, politically desperate to end the costly business of running an empire that was becoming increasingly ungovernable. Lord Louis Mountbatten was sent to India as the last viceroy with a mandate to transfer power. His original timeline was June 1948. He moved it forward by 10 months to August 1947. Why? Because the communal violence already beginning across India was spiraling out of control, and Mountbatten believed that speed was the solution. He was catastrophically wrong. Speed was not the solution. Speed was the cause of everything that followed. Because in the rush to leave, Britain handed the problem of drawing the border to a single man, a lawyer who had never been to India. Cyril Radcliffe was 50 years old in 1947, a distinguished British barrister, intelligent by all accounts, competent in his field. But his field was British law, not South Asian demographics, not centuries of intertwined religious communities, and it was not the impossible human geography of Punjab and Bengal, where the populations of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs were so mixed that no clean line could ever exist. He was given 5 weeks. No detailed maps of population distributions, no time for proper consultation with community leaders, no meaningful process for hearing from the millions of people whose lives depended on where he drew his line. He sat in his villa, studied whatever documents he could find, made decisions about villages, towns, rivers, and farmland that would separate families, displace millions, and trigger violence on a scale that defies comprehension. And he did it in 5 weeks. Because Britain needed to leave, and someone had to draw the line. August 15, 1947, India and Pakistan are declared independent. The celebrations are extraordinary. Jawaharlal Nehru gives his famous speech, a moment of triumph for a people who had fought for independence for decades. But Radcliffe's line has not yet been published. The border between the two new nations. The line that determines which villages, which farms, which cities, which water sources belong to which country, has not been announced. Independence has been declared, but nobody knows exactly where one country ends and the other begins. August 17, 1947. 2 days after independence, the Radcliffe Line is published, and everything falls apart. The line is not what anyone expected. Communities that assumed they would be in India find themselves in Pakistan. Communities that assumed they would be in Pakistan find themselves in India. Sikhs, whose most sacred sites are now on the Pakistani side of the border. Muslims, whose families are now split across a new international boundary. Farmers whose land is in one country and whose market is now in another. The line cuts through the middle of Punjab, one of the most fertile and densely populated regions in the subcontinent. It cuts through villages, through farms, through communities that have existed for centuries. And it was drawn by a man who left India the day it was published. Cyril Radcliffe flew home on August 17th, the same day his line was announced. He never returned. What followed is almost impossible to describe. 14 million people begin moving. Muslims from what is now India moving toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs from what is now Pakistan moving toward India. The largest mass migration in human history, in both directions, simultaneously, on roads, on foot, by bullock cart, and most fatally, by train. And as these columns of millions move toward their new countries, they pass columns of millions moving in the opposite direction. And the violence begins. Villages are massacred. Columns of refugees are attacked. Women are abducted, raped, and killed on a scale that historians still struggle to fully document. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 1 million. Most historians believe the true figure is closer to 2 million. Some estimates go higher. In 6 weeks, the trains. If there is a single image that captures the horror of partition, it is the trains. Trains were how most people moved. Trains packed beyond capacity with refugees fleeing in both directions. And trains became targets. Armed groups would board trains or stop them at stations and kill every passenger, every man, every woman, every child of the wrong religion. Trains arrived at stations in Pakistan full of dead Hindu and Sikh passengers. Trains arrived at stations in India full of dead Muslim passengers, sometimes with messages written on the carriages. A gift to you. The violence on the trains was so systematic and so total that entire trainloads of people were killed. Not wounded, not robbed, killed. Every person on board. This is the detail that historians know. that the general public has largely forgotten or was never taught. Subscribe to History Under Radar right now. Every week, we go deeper into the stories they buried. The women of partition deserve their own documentary. Estimates suggest that between 75,000 and 100,000 women were abducted, raped, or killed during partition, on both sides, by men of all religions. Women were used as weapons, their bodies as territory, their suffering as a message to the other community. Many women chose death over capture. Families killed their own daughters, wives, and sisters rather than allow them to be taken. The specific violence directed at women during partition is one of the most thoroughly documented and thoroughly ignored aspects of the entire catastrophe. India and Pakistan have both found it easier to remember the national triumph of independence than to fully reckon with what was done to women in its name. And where was Britain? Britain had declared independence on August 15th. The violence began almost immediately, and Britain, the colonial power that had ruled India for almost 2 centuries, that had drawn the line through Punjab and Bengal, that had decided the timeline, that had chosen the man who drew the border, was gone. Mountbatten stayed in India as Governor-General for a time, but the British response to the catastrophe unfolding was largely one of horrified observation. They had transferred power. The violence was now someone else's problem. The line had been drawn. The lawyer had gone home. The soldiers had been recalled. And 2 million people died. Cyril Radcliffe received a knighthood for his work in India. He burned his papers, every document related to his decisions about the border. Burned. He never gave an interview about partition, never wrote a memoir, never spoke publicly about what he had done. He lived until 1977, 30 years after the line he drew killed 2 million people. And he took his reasoning to his grave. We do not know exactly why he drew the line where he drew it in the most contested areas. We do not know what alternatives he considered. We do not know whether he understood what the consequences of his decisions would be, because he burned the evidence and never spoke about it again. Here is what the partition of India actually tells us. Not about Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs, not about Pakistan or India specifically, but about the specific way that colonial power ends. Empires do not leave cleanly. They leave in a hurry. They leave with their interests protected. They draw their lines and pack their bags, and they leave the consequences to the people who have to live with those lines forever. Radcliffe drew his border in 5 weeks. The subcontinent has been living with it for 75 years. The Kashmir conflict that has brought 2 nuclear-armed nations to the brink of war multiple times. The sectarian violence that continues to this day. The 3 wars between India and Pakistan. All of it traceable to 5 weeks in a villa in New Delhi, and a lawyer who burned his papers and never spoke about it again. That is not ancient history. That is the world we live in right now. And it was made in 5 weeks by a man who had never been to India. Remember that. History Under Radar. Subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs to understand where the world they live in came from. And come back next Sunday, because we are just getting started.